This morning I'm going to be playing the role of Roger Gamble. So I'm filling in for him. See, I don't know what that means yet. I'm really looking forward. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to next week. Roger's going to finish out the month of February for us. So really looking forward to hearing what he's going to bring. Do any of you remember those old books? They were kind of like Choose Your Adventure books. Does that ring a bell to anybody? You'd kind of read a little bit, and then you had to decide whether the person went up or went down, and you'd go to a certain page and it'd tell you how the adventure went. So today's going to be a little bit like that. Today's class is going to be a little bit of a Choose Your Adventure class, and I want to start off with a question to see which way we're going to go. Do you guys like or prefer adult class teachers that just give you the answer of what the problem is or how to solve the issue or what this means? Or do you prefer adult class teachers that just ask questions and send you on your way? This is the discussion part. So do you prefer, when faced with a difficult question that comes out of a Bible class, do you prefer that the teacher doesn't make you wait and just gives you an answer? Or would you prefer to really round out the question and leave it with you? Well, that's always a question, isn't it? And I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to leave you with it.
Depends on if you grade by showing your work.
Yeah.
Show your work to get to that answer.
Okay. Anyone? Alan? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
By probing questions and things like that.
Mm-hmm. You know, Jesus doesn't answer a lot of questions. He asks quite a few. In fact, even when he's asked questions, he doesn't answer a lot of them. He asks other questions. Why?
His goal is to get people to think and ponder and stretch their mind and stretch their way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, I think, what a good teacher does, but I call it facilitation, which is different.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes it seemed like there were loaded questions that already had a
Right.
predetermined answer by the person that was asking the question. And Jesus was able to see that.
And if the person comes to the conclusion themselves, they take ownership of that decision of what to do with that information, change or continue as they've been.
In November of this year, I will have been happily married for 30 years. And that's kind of crazy to think about. Some of you got me whipped by a mile. Mm-hmm. But did you know that I'm still learning how to be married? Husbands, are you still learning how to be married? I want to see if everybody's smart enough to raise their hand. How many of you raised your hand because you knew it was the right thing to do? Did you notice that only the younger ones did that? It is. This morning we are going to look at 3 really difficult stories in 2 Samuel and 1 Kings. And they're the kind of stories that, quite frankly, I don't think we really like to look at. I'll just give you a heads up on what they are. The first one is the 3 years of famine. I think it's in 2 Samuel 2 or 22. The 3 years of famine that come about because the Gibeonites are still mad about what Saul did. Does anybody remember this story? Larry does. before I jump into the pool, let me tell you something that I suspect. I suspect that Genesis, Exodus, even Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy were pretty easy reads. They aren't all that hard to get through. But now that we're in the story of the kings, and quite frankly, we're dealing with a fair amount of violence, and we're dealing with a fair amount of violence that God is involved with, that the reading has gotten harder, that finding time to read maybe has gotten harder. And maybe you've thought, this is really hard to read because there's a lot of names in here I don't know and a lot of places here that I don't know. Or maybe you found it hard to read because I don't like these stories. And maybe some of you have kind of stopped reading and thought, I'll go to class and I'll hear the presentation and I'll get a bunch out of it that way. But I'm having a hard time plugging into the reading. I really appreciated Jay's sermon this morning, talking about a complete faith. But I want to tell you something. I want to challenge you this morning with the idea that we can't have a complete faith unless we know the complete God. Does that make sense? I may not fully understand the God of the Old Testament. I may not fully like the stories that come out of the Old Testament. But they are very much who God is. In fact, I don't think it would be all that theologically wrong when we read the stories in the Old Testament, if instead when we saw the word God, if we didn't read God, Jesus, and the Spirit did this or said this. Does that make sense? Jesus was there when God said, yes, Gibeonites, why don't you go and tell David to collect 7 men from the lineage of Saul and have them put to death. God didn't step in and say, hey, that sounds kind of harsh. Jesus didn't step in and say, hey, God, let's not do this. This sounds awful. The Spirit was there when David had to pick between 3 years of being pursued by 3 people or 3 days of pestilence. Those were the punishments for counting the numbers of the Israelite troops that we're going to talk about also. Go back to Sodom and Gomorrah. Jesus didn't hide in the corner and say, man, I really hope we can get to the day where we don't have to let people see God like this. He was there. He was in agreement. They were unified. So these stories about God, these stories about David, who is deeply in love with this God, are things that we as Christians today have to be thinking about. So somebody tell me a little bit this story of the Gibeonites. Who are the Gibeonites, and why are we bringing them back up?
They're the ones that came up with the survival plan when Israel came into the land. They sent a group and had them outfitted in worn-out clothing. They took stale provisions and showed up and said, we've traveled a long way, we've heard about you, and wonder if we could strike a deal with you.
Mm-hmm. And God tells Saul, don't destroy them. And what's Saul's choice? It says, out of a zealousness for God, Saul decides to go after them and destroy them. Is it good to be zealous for God? Is it good to go further than what God has said to do out of zealousness? Yeah, apparently not. So how does David find out that the Gibeonites are still hurt over this? Someone help me explain what some of the mechanisms here might be.
Still essentially indentured servants
Mm-hmm.
to the Israelites. They're hewers of wood and drawers of water, I think is what,
Yeah.
they're hard workers, but they're not getting, they don't have the right to vote.
But we see in the story that it says that there's a famine for 3 years. And David inquires of the Lord, hey, what's the deal with the famine? Those weren't his exact words. So, had the Gibeonites made the famine happen? Where's the famine come from? God sent it. Why would God send a famine? To get Israelites or to David's attention?
The covenant they had made with those people.
So is it fair to say that it is entirely possible that the Gibeonites had been praying to God for vengeance or for justice or for something? Are the Gibeonites Israelites? Are they part of the chosen people? But yet the chosen people are being punished because Saul, the sovereign king, did something several years ago that the Gibeonites are still stuck because of.
King Saul committed, he was the one who broke the covenant, and it was at, like, what would you call it, a corporate or a federal level. He did it for the entire nation because he represented all of Israel. And so when he broke the covenant that he made, then all of Israel became guilty for it.
So, as we're thinking about this, is this a fair way to resolve this issue? Is, in your mind, is this a fair way to resolve this issue, that God sends famine on the land for 3 years, and then when David finally realizes what the cause of this is, he goes to the Gibeonites, and they say what? We don't want gold or silver for compensation, we want what? 7 sons of Saul, 7 descendants, male descendants of Saul. We want them, and we're going to hang them. And what does David do? He picks them. He picks the 7. This is a rough movie, right? This is worse than Yellowstone. Right? This level of gore doesn't even really happen in Lord of the Rings. I'm not kidding. This is, can I use the word barbaric? Are we okay with that? David picks 7 of Saul's offspring and gives them over to the Gibeonites, and they're hung. Are you okay with God's role in this?
Covenant seriously.
God takes covenant seriously. We could put that on in our notebook in our journal for things that God finds important. Covenant. What's important to God? Covenant. Okay?
It's a little bit irrelevant, though. I think it's what I think about what God, because he did it. And, you ask, why do bad things happen? Sometimes those bad things happen because you're stupid, you make bad decisions, right? And so this is one of those situations where you look at, why does this bad thing happen? Well, it's because Saul was stupid, he made a bad decision. And now this is the consequence for that. Did I do it? No. That doesn't mean that God is not fair or just. But it does mean that, God sees us as a people, his people, and as a people, we're held accountable to actions.
I want you to hold on to that thought. It doesn't matter what I think. Because I think that's part of it. I think that's one way to approach it. Speaking of doing dumb things, a little bit later in David's life, as he's kind of looking at all of his accomplishments and looking at the kingdom that he's getting ready to leave to Solomon, he comes up with an interesting idea, which Larry and I had a chuckle this morning because we were in the back trying to usher people in and find seats. And, should we count how many people are here? So we decided that we would count the empty seats because maybe we wouldn't get quite as much trouble for that. We're counting the people that aren't here. Somebody tell me about that story. What's that story all about? Why would David count? Why would God get mad? And why did it turn into such a catastrophe? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
How many people are in my army? I compare it to their army. And I go, their army is smaller or bigger? Okay, then I can take it.
right.
But that's not trusting in God.
Correct. Yeah, he was measuring his power. Yeah, it's somewhat similar, isn't it?
Demonstrates to everybody there that's the wrong thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, don't do this.
Yeah.
And like the spies going into the promised land, some of them said, oh, there's no way we can do this.
Uh-huh.
But it was about them, right?
Right.
And
So this,
in all those examples, the whole nation of Israel suffered because of those things. And it wasn't just the one who did it. Everybody collectively suffered from it.
and sometimes a generation later. Larry.
I don't know what to do with this, but I'm just going to tell you what I found. In Exodus 30, when the Lord tells Moses to count the people, he tells him that when you take a census of the people of Israel, then each shall give a ransom for his life to the Lord when you number them, that there be no plague among them when you number them. David took account, but they gave no ransom.
Mm-hmm. Right. And there was a plague that he chose. That was the bad genie in the bottle. You get 3 choices. You get 3 wishes, right? So, and it even gets more complicated because if you read the 2 Samuel account versus the Chronicles account, there's kind of some change in the language there that almost makes it sound like either God allowed David to be tempted by this thing or somehow God made it an option for David to be tempted by this thing. Daryl, you were kind of nodding your head. Do you want to?
When you look at the first verse in 2 Samuel, it says God incited. And I think is it Chronicles, it says Satan did it.
Chronicles 21, 1 Chronicles 21:1.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the language is a lot more problematic when God gets mad at David for doing something that he incited.
Mm-hmm.
Satan had to ask God's permission to punish, to persecute Saul.
So, is God complex? Yeah.
More than complex, it's, and the Bible tells us that we can't really understand the way God thinks.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think to me, yeah, complex maybe, but, you know, I can understand some pretty complex subjects, if I study hard enough, but I don't get the impression I can study, especially the Old Testament, hard enough and figure out God's way of thinking. To me, there's just so many things that seem what I would call unfair.
That's a fair thing to say.
I mean, this plague killed 70,000 people in 3 days. It's like, wow,
Yeah.
70,000.
Yeah.
That's a population of Edmond or something, you know?
Yeah, and the angel's just going around dropping people.
He's a king, but he's a vassal king.
Yeah,
It's
he
just
is.
a reminder of who the king really is, and it's still
Right.
God. And so I've been told, you know, how many championships has Michael Jordan won? And I got roped into that. It said 6. I'm like, nope, he never won any. Chicago Bulls won 6. Right? And so I think this is kind of David's, you know, we talk all the time at lunch, who's the greatest basketball player to ever live? Is it Michael? Is it Kobe? Is it, you know, we go
Right.
through all these, but we don't talk about the teams that surround them, that make them who they are. And I think if David is counting the men, it's kind of his Michael Jordan moment of, let me tell you how many rings that I have, versus this
Sure.
is the Lord's army. And so, and, you know, we read about Gideon, it doesn't matter how many men. God actually took men away from the army so they didn't think that they were the ones that did it.
We've got these great stories coming at the end of David's life where they're attacking the Philistines again. And it's kind of a flashback, greatest hits, if you will. Because all of a sudden, all these cousins, I guess, of Goliath show up, right? And David and his mighty men are dropping them like, you know, flies. And it goes through, and this was a relative of the giants, and this was a relative of the giants, and all this. And you could just see David going, I am going out on such a cool note, right? David's such an interesting character. David is so deeply and passionately in love with this God, having never met Jesus, having never heard the gospel, having never seen the compassion that we're going to experience through studying who the Christ is. David is passionately in love with the God of the Old Testament and has nothing negative to say other than, how much longer until you get me out of this? Can we say that? Are we ready to say that? Last one I want to look at is in 1 Kings, in our first couple of chapters of 1 Kings, which is like a bad episode of The Crown, or maybe a good episode of The Crown. And that is that David's literally on his way out, and he's talking to Solomon about all the people that probably shouldn't live past the first 5 minutes of Solomon being king. And then you have the story of Solomon and his brother, and the young girl who kept David warm. I hope you're reading, because otherwise you're going, what are you talking about? Yeah. Apparently she was cute, and Adonijah thought it would be a great thing to have her as his wife. And Solomon sees that as a power play, right? Was it a power play? Probably. Being passive-aggressive at this moment in history, not a good choice. And Solomon has a guy left over from David who's basically the king's hitman, right? If you get a visit from this guy, I can't remember his name, but if you get a visit from this guy, it's not going well for you. Joab, thank you. No, it's, who? Is it Joab? Am I? 1 Kings, who kills Adonijah? I I don't know why I'm so interested in this all of a sudden. 2. Benaniah, son of Jehoiada. Benaniah was not somebody you wanted an afternoon visit from unexpectedly. So again, this is how Solomon's reign is going to start, is by basically eliminating several people who could be challengers to the throne. Has any of you, after an election, a presidential election in the last, 15 years, said, well, he ain't my president. I didn't vote for him. He's not my president. Anybody ever felt that way? See, if I can go over 20 years, I can kind of capture both sides here. Isn't that kind of an American thing to think? That if I don't pick you, if I don't approve of you, then you are not in charge of me. Isn't that kind of an American trait? We don't give our fealty easily. We like grace and forgiveness. The problem is that we live in a culture right now that doesn't like the concept of sin. Lots of things that we know are wrong, our culture today is telling us, you know what's really wrong is you're calling it wrong. We don't call these things wrong. That's hurtful, and you're hurtful for calling it wrong. And I can't believe you would believe in such a barbaric, fake entity as this God that you claim. And so churches across the United States of America are moving further and further away from a respect and fear of a God who does the stuff that he does in the Old Testament. What do you think about that? Do we still need to live our lives in acknowledgement and in respect of the exact God who acted the way that he acted in the Old Testament? Or has God become so neutered by time that we can decide what's right and wrong?
Well, I've thought all along for a while, and I have to apply this myself. It's really arrogant to try to second guess God.
Mm-hmm.
Because if he's God, you don't know enough to second guess it. And yet, I can think of occasions in my life where I think that's what I've done.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's behind our culture today, is an arrogance that it's the humanism. We can make our own decisions about what's right, what's wrong. We can take a pew poll or something, and we'll
Mhm.
get the right answer regardless of what your ancient book
Mm-hmm.
says.
But we're not unique,
No.
in that we're going our own way. These first few pages of the Bible that we've been reading has taught us anything. It's like they all did it, and they woke up one day and say, you know what's better? It's God's way.
Mhm.
That we've done this for a while, and it's speaking to the arrogance piece. Is we're just such a snapshot. We've gone over thousands of years here,
Mm-hmm.
and here I am, 40, 60, 80 years old, in this room. What we represent, it's nothing compared to, we see generational punishment that happened generations after that deed took place.
Mm-hmm.
It is arrogant, to borrow Terry's mind, to think that we are in such, God is so indebted to us that he gives us our justice now,
Mhm.
or shows his punishment now, as opposed to what all of our heroes of faith witnessed is a patience in waiting on God's justice.
We continue to have our Tower of Babel moments, thinking that we can build and get to where God is, and then we will be like God.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, I mean, I'm not saying that I don't try to do that myself, but if we ever get to that point where we know everything that God's thinking, then I'm God.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, think about how much of God's character that we can't even fathom yet until we have it revealed to us in heaven someday. I mean, we're just getting a smidgen of who he is. But we think because we know this smidgen, then we know God.
Certainly the world has changed so much that we know much better than we used to know. The answer to that, by the way, is no. We've been asking the question, what is important to God? I want to ask the mirror of that question, and that is, what is important to Jesus? When Jesus was on this world, was he pushing the boundaries? He was pushing the boundaries of people, but he was not pushing the boundaries of God.
I may be speaking out of turn now, but he was pointing out that sin is very, very important. That punishment for sin is very important. You know, God is not going to just wink at sin and say, oh, well, I can be a just God and let you guys off. He's going to exact the punishment for what's wrong, and it's by his standard. So, if you look at the God of the Old Testament and compare him to Jesus, he's a God of great mercy because all of his wrath is poured out on Jesus one day.
Mm-hmm.
That's the most wrath we'll ever read about in the Bible.
I totally agree with that. And you beat me by about 4 minutes to that point. No, you did great, because I stalled out too long on some other stuff. We cannot understand, and that's why I said what Jay did this morning was so good. We cannot understand what we have been saved from at the cross if we don't study what we're being saved from in the Old Testament. If we don't realize what the cross actually gives us, then am I making sense? If you don't see where we came from and what we were really deserving of, and what our sin did to our communities, if we don't understand that Jesus solved that, we don't understand what we've been saved from. People came back from war who fought and protected our country. Small little analogy, doesn't even pale. But they fought for our country and they came home and they wondered, does anybody really understand what we did to save this place? And a generation later, no, they don't. Right? Great Depression happens. A couple generations later, people are back into the same spending and borrowing habits that they were before because they forgot. Does anybody doubt that we have forgotten? Does anybody doubt that we really haven't embraced how bad it was and how amazing it is what Jesus was actually able to save us from? We live in a culture today that is telling us you don't need to pay attention to a God like that. You need to have your church. You need to have your beliefs. You need to have your mental thoughts structured around where the culture is today. And I'm going to tell you, we're not going to do that. Because the same God who did all of these amazing and scary and frightening and grace-filled and wonderful salvation things in the Old Testament is the exact same God we have today. And I'm going to encourage you that if you have set your Bible reading down and you're showing up thinking, I'm just going to benefit from the class, please pick your Bible back up. And I'll tell you this, it doesn't get easier. It doesn't get easier as we go through the kings, the good ones and the bad ones. It doesn't get easier when we get to the major prophets and we get to hear God talking about how he quite frankly wants to just destroy everybody because of their evilness. It doesn't get better. But this is the God that we need to get to know, because we can't pick and choose which parts of God we like and which parts we don't. If we're going to be mature in our faith, we have to be able to know who God is as best as He can describe us. And this is a big chunk of God describing who He is. This is a big chunk of Jesus being described. This is a big chunk of the Spirit being described. We have to decide not which parts of God we want, but whether we want God as He is. And if we're going to be a church in today's world that is true, then we're going to have to, with our eyes open, follow the God that is. We're also getting ready to get into a chunk of the Psalms. I love the Psalms. I've done a generator group on the Psalms. Whenever life is hard, I go to the Psalms. The problem I have with what we're getting ready to do is we're getting ready to read Psalm after Psalm after Psalm after Psalm. And it doesn't really work that way. What really needs to happen is you need to read a Psalm 5 or 6 times over several days and understand it, because each Psalm, quite frankly, is an event. It's an event in somebody's life. What's the difference between poetry and prose? What are some differences between poetry and prose? There's some rhyme, some mechanics. Prose is often narrative, right? Here's what happened. Poetry is, here's how I feel. Here's what I experienced. Here's what it means. Here's how it affected me. What's crazy is that most of these Psalms are written by David. This is David's life's work. This wasn't written in a couple of weeks as he went through and just jotted down a bunch of new songs for the songbook. These were things that he pondered likely for days or weeks or months, that he lived through, and then he would write his experience of that thing, of how he was changed through that thing, how he pondered who God was in those spaces and in those times. And they represent big chunks of David's experiences. I saw a reel the other day, just a short video, from the songwriter Sting. He was the lead singer for The Police. You remember the song Roxanne? Basically a loose translation of the book of Hosea. Yes, that's a joke. But he was talking about music today, and he said, music today has really changed a lot. It's really kind of been simplified. It's much more linear. He said in the old days you would have a couple of verses, and then you'd have a bridge, and then maybe a verse and a conclusion. He goes, today it's just verse, 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 song's over. And he goes, and I really kind of lament that, he said, because the reality is the bridge is actually this wonderful thing that takes place in a song. He goes, maybe the song starts out, I've lost my girlfriend, she's broken up with me, I'm heartsick, I'm never going to be right again, I'm never going to find love again. He goes, but then the song modulates, it takes a slightly different feel. And then the songwriter talks about maybe how that, in that moment, he's starting to think something different could happen. Maybe there could be a new beginning. Maybe there could be a new love. Maybe he's learned from something that he shouldn't have done to make that happen. And then there's a conclusion to the story that kind of says, hey, things could change. And when I saw that reel, I thought, hey, those are the Psalms. So many of David's laments, terrible, 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 and yet. So David's talking about all of this terrible stuff. So think about how long a breakup really takes. You know, if you're in high school, it happens in a weekend. But if you're an adult, they take longer, right? And David's, these laments are kind of like breakups. They're big events in David's life. So we have all of these Psalms that are all of these big events. So I want you to think about the fact, as we're wrapping up here, that David is an interesting character because he's not just the king, He's a poet king. And I think that's so fascinating because we normally think, well, he's a warrior king. But God makes room in the text for art. Have you thought about that? Song of Solomon. Some would say that Job kind of fits in there. But the Psalms they're poetry. And that means that in some way, God really values art. This is a strange thing to be saying from up here. But that means that God really values the songs that we sing and the people who write them. God really values the talents, the diverse talents that He gives all of us. I kind of enjoy being up here. A lot of you don't enjoy being up here. But you probably enjoy something else. David, I don't know that David sang these songs. I know that Psalms, I know he wrote them. You know, they were used in worship. But I'm just amazed that we sometimes think that certain abilities are elevated. But God has given all of us abilities to shine in the kingdom. David not only was the king, but he pondered God. He didn't come up with all the answers. In fact, his Psalms ask a lot of questions. And he spent a lot of time pondering who God was, and he always comes up to the conclusion that God is good. So I'm going to encourage you, this is where I want to leave today. I want to encourage you, if you're reading along with us, keep reading. If you've taken a pause, jump back in. Come wrestle with us. Come discover this complicated, amazing, big God. Ask the hard questions. Ask God the hard questions. Pray about these hard questions. Look at God as much as He wants to show you of Him. So that when we talk about, for the rest of this month and going forward, what it means to have a mature faith, we want you to know who you have a mature faith in. Not just the God of the New Testament, not just Jesus, but all of God that He wants to show you. It is our life work. I will very likely spend my whole life constantly getting to know Kelly and discovering new things about my wife. God is so much more even than her, and I need to stay on that track, and I would encourage us to stay on that track together. So think about all those things. Think about how our culture is pushing you to ignore this stuff. Think about how our culture is telling you that there's something bad about looking at that. We want to drive right into it with our headlights on and accept this invitation from God to explore. Okay? Larry, would you close us in prayer from where you are?
Father, as we continue to read and think about you, we realize that you are a great and awesome God, that you are beyond the reach of our imagination. But that as we seek you and long for you, that you will reveal yourself to us. For we know that you are good and holy and righteous, and that you have redeemed us, and we are your people. Through your Son Jesus, we pray. Amen.
All right, thank you.